The easiest way to measure a person's character is to watch how they treat someone they believe has nothing to offer. The morning sun reflected across the polished glass walls of Reynolds' development headquarters, casting long beams of light over marble floors where executives, investors, architects, and city officials gathered for the company's annual leadership showcase. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance while photographers captured smiling business leaders arriving in tailored suits. Employees stood proudly beside scale models of the company's newest multi-million-dollar skyscraper, confident the event would strengthen investor confidence before the next phase of construction began. Among the stream of distinguished guests walked Daniel Brooks, a 44-year-old single father wearing clean construction boots, faded work pants, a reflective safety vest folded neatly over one arm, and a weathered notebook tucked beneath it. His appearance contrasted sharply with the polished elegance surrounding him, yet his posture remained calm and dignified. He had been invited by the engineering department to deliver updated field observations regarding the company's most important project before the executive presentation. Daniel quietly approached the reception desk and politely introduced himself. The receptionist smiled warmly and contacted the engineering office, asking him to wait only a few minutes inside the spacious lobby. Daniel thanked her before stepping aside, careful not to block arriving guests. At that exact moment, Victoria Reynolds, the company's celebrated chief executive officer, entered through the revolving glass doors surrounded by senior executives, board advisors, and several influential investors visiting from across the country. Every conversation seemed to pause as cameras followed her confident stride across the lobby. She greeted investors with practiced confidence before suddenly noticing Daniel standing near the reception area in his construction clothing. Her expression shifted almost instantly. She slowed her pace, looked directly at Daniel, then glanced toward the receptionist. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Why is a construction worker standing in the middle of our executive event?" The cheerful atmosphere quietly faded. The receptionist nervously explained that engineering had invited him for an important project discussion. Victoria barely allowed her to finish. "This event is for leadership, investors, and professionals," she replied with a faint smile that carried little warmth. "There is a service entrance around the back of the building. Someone should show him where deliveries belong." A few uncomfortable laughs escaped from people hoping to impress the chief executive officer, while many others simply lowered their eyes. Daniel remained completely still. He did not defend himself. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded respectfully and answered with quiet sincerity. "I apologize if my presence caused any inconvenience. I was only following the instructions I received." His calm response somehow made the silence even heavier. Victoria turned away without another word, believing the brief exchange had already been forgotten. Daniel gently thanked the receptionist for her kindness, adjusted the notebook beneath his arm, and began walking toward the exit exactly as requested. As the glass doors slowly closed behind him, several members of the company's board of directors stepped out of a nearby conference room after finishing a private meeting. They had witnessed every word. None of them interrupted the moment. None of them defended Daniel in public. But as they quietly watched the single father disappear into the bright Chicago morning without anger, resentment, or humiliation on his face, an uneasy silence settled across the lobby. One board member finally looked toward another and spoke almost in a whisper. "Does anyone here actually know who that man is?" Daniel Brooks drove home without replaying the embarrassing scene in his mind, because life had already taught him that dignity was never determined by another person's opinion. His aging pickup truck rolled through quiet suburban streets lined with maple trees just as children began returning home from school. The moment he parked in front of his modest white house, the front door opened. Before he even reached the porch, 12-year-old Emily Brooks ran toward him carrying a science project carefully balanced in her arms. "Dad, I finished the bridge model," she said with excited pride. Daniel smiled warmly as though nothing difficult had happened that morning. "I knew you would," he replied. Together they stepped inside the small but welcoming home where framed family photographs, neatly arranged books, and handmade school artwork filled every room with warmth instead of luxury. Daniel prepared dinner while Emily enthusiastically explained her day at school. She never asked why he seemed quieter than usual, because she had learned long ago that her father carried his burdens without allowing them to become hers. After dinner, they sat together at the kitchen table, where Emily carefully placed her wooden bridge model beside Daniel's weathered notebook. She pointed proudly toward the tiny support beams. "I remembered what you taught me," she said. "The strongest part is usually the part nobody notices." Daniel looked at the model before smiling with genuine pride. "That lesson works for buildings," he answered softly. "And it works for people too." Later that evening, after Emily had gone upstairs to finish her homework, Daniel quietly opened the same notebook he carried everywhere. Every page contained detailed engineering sketches, structural calculations, handwritten observations, and careful measurements gathered over months while working on Reynolds Development's flagship project. Although officially employed as a builder, Daniel never stopped thinking like an engineer. During every shift, he quietly studied load paths, steel connections, foundation movement, and construction tolerances, writing down anything that deserved another look. Several recent pages focused on one specific transfer beam near the center of the new skyscraper. Something about its revised connection detail continued troubling him. He compared field measurements collected over the previous 2 weeks with the approved construction drawings. The numbers refused to agree. Daniel checked every calculation again, then once more using a different engineering method. The conclusion remained unchanged. A subtle design revision made months earlier had unintentionally altered the building's load distribution. The structure remained safe for the moment, but if construction continued without correction, the stress would gradually accumulate in one critical section, creating expensive repairs after completion. Daniel quietly leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a brief moment. He understood exactly what needed to be corrected. He also understood that after the public humiliation earlier that day, very few people inside the company would be willing to listen to him. Still, he carefully rewrote his calculations with complete clarity, attached supporting sketches, and prepared a concise engineering summary explaining the potential issue without criticizing anyone involved. He signed only his employee identification number instead of his name because protecting the project mattered far more than receiving personal recognition. Before shutting his notebook, Daniel looked toward the staircase where Emily's bedroom light still glowed beneath the door. A gentle smile crossed his face. Everything he had given up, every title he had left behind, every opportunity he had quietly declined, had been for moments exactly like this. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the distant Chicago skyline, where the unfinished tower stood against the night sky. Unaware that the quiet builders so easily dismissed that morning might already be the only person capable of protecting everything the company had worked so hard to build. The following morning, Reynolds Development no longer carried the same atmosphere of confidence that had filled its headquarters during the leadership event. Before 8 o'clock, the company's engineering monitoring system automatically flagged an unexpected structural variance inside the flagship skyscraper. The warning appeared insignificant at first, yet as additional field data arrived from overnight inspections, more alerts began appearing across multiple engineering dashboards. Senior project managers gathered inside the operations center while structural consultants compared sensor readings with the approved construction models. None of the numbers appeared catastrophic, yet none of them agreed with one another either. Victoria Reynolds entered the executive conference room expecting a routine progress briefing, only to find anxious faces staring at projection screens filled with engineering diagrams instead of financial reports. "Tell me we are looking at faulty sensors," she said confidently. The chief structural engineer slowly shook his head. "We hoped that was the explanation. We replaced the monitoring sequence twice. The readings remain consistent." Another consultant enlarged the three-dimensional structural model onto the wall. "The load redistribution appears to be developing near the central transfer system, but every simulation produces a different explanation." Victoria folded her arms. "Bring in outside specialists." Within hours, nationally recognized engineering consultants joined the meeting through secure video conferences, while additional experts arrived in person from neighboring states. Every team analyzed the data using different software platforms, independent calculations, and alternate modeling techniques. The conclusions remained frustratingly incomplete. They could identify where unusual stress appeared, but no one could explain why it had developed. Meanwhile, Construction crews received instructions to temporarily pause work around the affected section until engineers completed another review. Hundreds of workers waited patiently while schedules slipped further behind. Each hour of delay threatened contracts worth millions of dollars, investor confidence, and the company's carefully protected reputation. Late that afternoon, Michael Lawson, the senior vice president of engineering, quietly entered the conference room carrying a thin printed report that had arrived through the company's internal technical review system earlier that morning. This was submitted anonymously during the night, he explained. Victoria barely glanced at the document. Another opinion? Michael nodded thoughtfully. Not exactly. Whoever prepared this report identified the same structural behavior we are seeing before today's monitoring system confirmed it. Several engineers immediately gathered around the table as Michael distributed copies. The report contained remarkably clear calculations, precise field measurements, detailed sketches, and a logical explanation tracing the problem back to a subtle revision made months earlier during construction planning. Every observation aligned perfectly with the newest sensor data. The final page proposed a practical solution requiring only limited reinforcement before additional floors were completed, potentially preventing months of reconstruction and enormous financial losses. One consultant looked up in disbelief. Whoever wrote this understands the building better than anyone currently in this room. Michael pointed toward the signature line. There was no name, only an employee identification number. Victoria frowned. Find out who submitted it. The Information Technology Department quickly searched the internal records before quietly sending a confidential message back to the engineering office. Michael read the response once before looking toward Victoria with an expression she could not immediately understand. He placed the printed identification record on the conference table without speaking. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the page. The employee number belonged to only one person, Daniel Brooks, the same quiet builder she had publicly dismissed less than 24 hours earlier. Silence settled across the executive conference room with a weight no financial report had ever carried. Every engineer present continued studying the anonymous technical analysis while comparing each calculation against the newest structural data streaming across the large digital displays. The deeper they examined the report, the more remarkable it became. Every assumption was supported by field measurements. Every conclusion followed sound engineering principles. Every recommendation aligned with the live monitoring system that had confused nationally recognized consultants throughout the day. Michael Lawson carefully turned another page before quietly speaking. This was not written overnight. Whoever prepared this has been observing the structure for weeks. Several engineers slowly nodded. Victoria Reynolds looked once more at the employee identification number printed beneath the final calculation. Bring Daniel Brooks here immediately, she instructed. Michael remained calm. Before we call him, there is something else you should see. He connected a secure personnel archive to the conference room display. Daniel's employment record appeared on the screen. At first it looked ordinary. Construction builder. Field operations. Excellent performance reviews. Perfect safety record. Then Michael opened an older archived file that had never been included in Daniel's current personnel summary because it belonged to his professional history before joining the company. The room became completely silent. Daniel Brooks had previously served as a senior structural engineer for one of the most respected engineering firms in the United States. His career included complex hospitals, transportation centers, emergency facilities, and award-winning commercial towers. Several engineering journals listed his published research. Multiple professional organizations had recognized innovative structural connection methods developed under his leadership. Even more surprising, several patented engineering improvements still carried his name. Victoria stared at the screen without speaking. Why is he working as a builder? She finally asked. The human resources director quietly answered through the conference call. After his wife passed away several years ago, Mr. Brooks voluntarily resigned from executive engineering management. He requested field work with predictable hours so he could raise his daughter himself. He repeatedly declined promotion opportunities because family came first. No one said another word. The board members sitting along the far side of the conference table exchanged thoughtful glances. One director remembered the previous morning inside the lobby. He never defended himself, she said softly. Another director replied, he did not need to. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes toward the polished conference table. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she questioned not someone else's judgment, but her own. She had dismissed a man without asking a single question about his experience, his character, or the reason he stood inside the building. Meanwhile, across the construction site, Daniel quietly assisted younger crew members with routine layout measurements as though nothing unusual had happened. He explained safety procedures, checked installation tolerances, and patiently answered questions from apprentices who admired both his knowledge and his willingness to teach. He never mentioned the engineering report submitted the previous evening. He never told anyone he believed the executive team had discovered his identity. Protecting the building remained more important than protecting his pride. Back inside headquarters, the chairman of the board slowly closed Daniel's personnel file before looking directly at Victoria. "Yesterday," he said calmly, "our company judged the appearance of a builder. Today we have learned we publicly humiliated one of the finest structural minds this industry has produced." The conference room fell into complete silence once again. This time no one searched for an explanation. Every person present already understood that the company's greatest crisis was no longer hidden inside the steel framework rising above Chicago. It had begun with one careless decision made in full public view. The following morning, the emergency board meeting began behind closed doors on the highest floor of Reynolds Development headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, but no one admired the view. Every board member carried a copy of Daniel Brooks's personnel history beside the anonymous engineering report that had already saved the company's most valuable project from a costly mistake. Financial forecasts, investor updates, and quarterly performance reports remained untouched. For the first time in years, the meeting centered not on revenue, but on judgment. The chairman quietly opened the discussion. "Before we address the structural issue, we need to address what happened in this building yesterday morning." The room remained silent. Victoria Reynolds understood exactly what he meant. Security footage from the lobby played across the large conference screen without sound. Everyone watched Daniel standing calmly near the reception desk before Victoria publicly dismissed him because of his appearance. No one interrupted the recording. No one attempted to justify the exchange. When the video ended, the silence seemed even heavier than before. One board member finally spoke. "We tell every employee that respect is one of our core values. Yesterday, we failed our own standard." Another director slowly opened Daniel's engineering portfolio. "We also failed to recognize extraordinary talent because we judged a uniform instead of a person." Victoria lowered her eyes. She had spent years building the company's reputation, yet one careless moment had exposed a weakness no financial success could hide. Meanwhile, across the construction site, Daniel continued supervising routine field activities as though nothing unusual had changed. He patiently explained revised installation details to younger builders, verified measurements with survey crews, and answered engineering questions whenever someone asked for guidance. His calm manner never suggested that the executive leadership was discussing his name at that very moment. To Daniel, the project still deserved his full attention because hundreds of families and businesses would one day depend upon the building being completed correctly. Back inside headquarters, Michael Lawson presented a detailed comparison between Daniel's recommendations and the revised engineering simulations completed overnight. Every independent review reached the same conclusion. Daniel's proposed correction solved the problem with minimal delay while avoiding millions of dollars in future reconstruction costs. The chief financial officer quietly summarized the numbers. "His solution protects our investors, our schedule, and our reputation." Another board member added, "The remarkable part is that he submitted the report anonymously. He never asked for recognition." Those words settled deeply throughout the room. Victoria slowly looked toward the personnel file once again. She noticed a handwritten statement preserved from Daniel's original employment interview years earlier. It read, "My greatest responsibility begins when my workday ends, because my daughter is waiting for her father." She quietly closed the folder. For the first time, she understood that Daniel had never measured success by titles, executive offices, or public recognition. His priorities had always rested somewhere far more important. The chairman finally broke the silence. "We have two responsibilities now. First, we must invite Mr. Brooks to help lead the technical correction. Second, We must decide whether our leadership reflects the values we claim to represent. No one argued. No one defended what had happened in the lobby. Outside the conference room, employees continued their work without knowing the conversation unfolding above them. Inside, however, every member of the board recognized that the company's greatest challenge was no longer hidden within steel beams or engineering calculations. It had become a question of character, and for the first time since Victoria Reynolds became chief executive officer, her own board was beginning to wonder whether the quiet single father they had ignored had demonstrated stronger leadership than the executive who had publicly shamed him. By early afternoon, the emergency board meeting reached a unanimous decision. Daniel Brooks had to be brought back into the engineering review immediately, not as a builder receiving instructions, but as the person most qualified to guide the solution. Michael Lawson volunteered to speak with him personally. He found Daniel exactly where everyone expected him to be, standing beside a group of younger builders reviewing steel alignment before the next inspection. Daniel patiently answered every question, checked each measurement twice, and thanked the crew for their attention to detail before noticing Michael approaching across the deck. "Do you have a minute?" Michael asked quietly. Daniel smiled politely. "Of course." They stepped away from the active work area while cranes continued lifting steel into position high above the Chicago skyline. Michael hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The board reviewed your report." Daniel nodded gently. "I assumed they eventually would." Michael continued, "They know it was you." Daniel showed no surprise. "I signed my employee number. I expected someone would trace it." Michael looked directly at him. "They also reviewed your engineering history." Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "That was a long time ago." Michael shook his head. "Not to this project. Your experience may have just saved the company." Daniel remained silent. He had never written the report to prove anyone wrong. He had written it because unfinished buildings could not defend themselves from preventable mistakes. "The board would like you to join the executive engineering meeting," Michael finally said. "They want you to explain your findings personally." Daniel looked toward the towering structure rising into the afternoon sky before answering with complete calm. "If it helps protect the building, I will come." Less than an hour later, Daniel entered the executive conference room, wearing the same clean work clothes he had worn every day on the construction site. This time no one looked at his boots. No one noticed the reflective vest folded neatly beneath his arm. Every eye focused instead on the weathered notebook he quietly placed upon the conference table. Victoria Reynolds slowly stood as Daniel entered. The confidence that had once defined her public image had been replaced by visible humility. Before anyone discussed engineering, she spoke first. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "before this meeting begins, I owe you an apology." Daniel remained respectfully silent. Victoria continued, "I judged your appearance instead of your character. I embarrassed you publicly without knowing who you were or what you had contributed to this company. That was my failure, not yours." The room became completely still. Daniel answered with the same quiet dignity that had guided every decision throughout the week. "Thank you for saying that." He offered no criticism. He asked for no explanation. He simply opened his notebook and turned to the first engineering sketch. "Now," he said gently, "may we save the building?" The atmosphere inside the conference room changed immediately. Engineers gathered around the table while Daniel calmly explained each calculation, tracing the unexpected load transfer through revised connection details and comparing field measurements with the digital structural model. Every recommendation was supported by clear evidence. Every answer resolved another question that had troubled consultants for days. As the final simulation completed on the large display, every warning indicator disappeared from the screen. No one celebrated with loud applause. Instead, an extraordinary silence filled the room as everyone realized the same quiet single father who had been asked to leave through the service entrance only yesterday had just restored confidence in a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars without asking for recognition, revenge, or reward. Construction resumed before sunrise the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose that spread across every level of the project. Engineers worked beside builders instead of remaining separated by titles, and supervisors encouraged questions rather than assuming they already possessed every answer. Daniel Brooks quietly coordinated the structural correction exactly as he had described during the executive meeting. He reviewed every connection personally, verified measurements with field crews, and patiently explained the revised installation sequence to younger workers who watched him with growing admiration. No one needed to be reminded of his qualifications anymore. His knowledge became visible through every calm instruction and every careful decision. Victoria Reynolds spent the day walking the construction site instead of remaining inside the executive offices. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she chose to listen more than she spoke. She observed Daniel answering questions from apprentices with the same respect he showed senior engineers. When an inexperienced worker admitted making a small measurement mistake, Daniel simply smiled and said, "Thank you for catching it now. Every correction made today protects someone tomorrow." The young builder nodded with visible relief before carefully fixing the issue. Victoria quietly realized that Daniel led people without demanding authority. His example inspired excellence instead of fear. Later that afternoon, the board of directors returned to inspect the progress. Michael Lawson presented updated engineering reports confirming that every revised structural simulation remained stable. Independent consultants verified Daniel's solution, and the latest monitoring data matched his calculations almost perfectly. The chairman looked across the active construction floor before turning toward the board members. "This project is recovering because one employee placed responsibility above recognition," he said quietly. Several directors agreed without hesitation. The chairman then requested a private conversation with Daniel inside the temporary conference office overlooking the site. Daniel entered carrying his familiar weathered notebook, expecting another technical discussion. Instead, the chairman smiled warmly before placing a folder on the table. "The board would like to offer you the position of Executive Vice President of Structural Engineering," he said. "Your salary, benefits, and authority would reflect everything you have accomplished." The room became completely silent. Daniel looked respectfully at the unopened folder before gently sliding it back across the table. "I am deeply grateful," he answered sincerely, "but I cannot accept." The directors exchanged surprised glances. "May we ask why?" one member quietly said. Daniel smiled with the same peaceful expression that had remained unchanged throughout the entire week. "Because every afternoon at 3:30, my daughter waits for me outside her school. She has already lost one parent. I promised myself she would never wonder whether she came second to my career." No one spoke for several long moments. The chairman slowly closed the folder. "Most people spend their lives chasing titles," he said softly. Daniel nodded. "Some titles are earned at work. The one I value most is simply Dad." As the board members watched him leave the office and walk back toward the construction crews, they understood something no business school had ever taught them. Leadership was not measured by the office someone occupied or the salary they earned. It was revealed by the values they refused to compromise when greater rewards stood within reach. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the steel framework with the same reflective vest, the same work boots, and the same quiet determination. Nothing about his appearance had changed, yet everyone who saw him now understood that true greatness had been standing beside them all along, wearing the uniform they had once been too proud to notice. Several weeks later, the atmosphere inside Reynolds Development had changed in ways no quarterly report could fully explain. Employees no longer judged one another by job titles, expensive suits, or office locations. Senior executives regularly visited construction sites to hear ideas from field crews, while engineers spent more time listening to builders whose practical experience often revealed details impossible to discover inside conference rooms alone. The transformation had not been ordered through corporate slogans or motivational speeches. It had begun quietly with one lesson the board refused to forget. During the company's monthly leadership assembly, every employee gathered inside the spacious atrium overlooking the nearly completed skyscraper. Sunlight streamed through towering glass walls, reflecting across polished stone floors and exposed structural steel that now stood stronger because someone had cared enough to speak when others remained silent. Victoria Reynolds stepped onto the stage carrying no prepared speech. She looked across hundreds of employees before taking a slow breath. "Several weeks ago," she began calmly, "I believed leadership meant making quick decisions with confidence. I have since learned that leadership begins with humility, listening, and respect." The audience remained completely silent. She continued without attempting to excuse her actions. I publicly judged a man by his work clothes instead of his character. I embarrassed someone whose wisdom ultimately protected every person in this company. My decision failed not only him, but every value we claim to represent. No one interrupted her words. Every employee understood exactly whom she meant. Victoria then invited Daniel Brooks to join her on stage. Daniel walked forward wearing the same clean builder uniform, reflective vest folded neatly beneath one arm, and weathered notebook that had become quietly familiar throughout the company. Nothing about his appearance suggested he had become the most respected person inside the organization. He simply smiled politely before standing beside the chief executive officer. Victoria turned toward him with complete sincerity. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "on behalf of Reynolds Development, I apologize for the disrespect you experienced in this building. Thank you for answering arrogance with grace and criticism with integrity." Daniel nodded gently before replying. "Thank you for your kindness. We all make mistakes. What matters most is what we choose to build afterward." Those simple words settled over the audience with remarkable power. The chairman of the board then stepped forward carrying a newly approved corporate policy manual. "Beginning today," he announced, "every leader within this company will complete field orientation alongside our construction crews before supervising any major project. Respect will no longer be something we print inside employee handbooks. It will become something we practice every day." The announcement was followed not by loud celebration, but by quiet understanding. Engineers looked toward builders with new appreciation. Executives shook hands with apprentices. Supervisors thanked workers whose names they had never previously learned. Daniel accepted none of the attention for himself. As soon as the meeting ended, he quietly returned to the construction floor where younger crew members waited for guidance on the next phase of installation. Victoria watched him walk away before realizing something that would remain with her for the rest of her career. The strongest leader inside Reynolds Development had never demanded authority, recognition, or applause. He had simply lived his values so consistently that everyone else eventually found themselves changing because of his example. In that quiet moment, the board understood they had not merely rescued a multi-million-dollar project. They had rebuilt the foundation of an entire company by choosing dignity over pride, humility over ego, and character over appearance. Several months later, the completed skyscraper stood proudly above the Chicago skyline, reflecting the first light of another spring morning across walls of glass that thousands of people now entered every day without ever realizing how close the project had once come to costly failure. Families visited businesses inside the tower, entrepreneurs signed new leases, and community organizations held meetings beneath the very structure that had been protected by the quiet determination of one single father who had never asked for recognition. Reynolds Development continued growing, but employees often said the company's greatest achievement had not been the building itself. It had been the culture rebuilt from the foundation upward. New executives were introduced to the company by spending time beside construction crews before entering boardrooms. Every manager learned that respect was demonstrated long before it was spoken. Daniel Brooks never returned to executive engineering, even though opportunities continued arriving from respected firms across the country. Each offer promised greater authority, larger salaries, and prestigious titles. Daniel politely thanked every recruiter before declining with the same peaceful smile. Every afternoon, he still parked outside Emily's middle school a few minutes before dismissal, waiting with a paperback book resting on the passenger seat until she came running toward the truck with stories about science projects, music rehearsals, and dreams for the future. One afternoon, Emily looked toward the downtown skyline, where the completed tower shimmered beneath the setting sun. "Dad," she asked softly, "does it ever bother you that most people will never know what you did?" Daniel smiled gently while watching the traffic move through the city streets. "Buildings are supposed to protect people without asking for applause," he replied. "Perhaps the people who build them should do the same." Emily leaned comfortably against the truck door before quietly answering, "I think they will remember you anyway." Several weeks later, Reynolds Development held the official dedication ceremony for the completed project. City leaders, investors, architects, engineers, builders, employees, and members of the board gathered inside the magnificent atrium where sunlight poured through soaring glass walls onto polished stone floors. Victoria Reynolds stood beside the chairman before inviting Daniel to join them. This time there were no cameras searching for dramatic moments and no speeches celebrating individual success. The chairman simply presented a small bronze plaque that would remain permanently inside the building. It did not mention executive titles or financial achievements. It read, "This building stands because integrity spoke quietly before pride learned to listen." Daniel looked at the inscription for a long moment before thanking everyone with only a respectful nod. The room slowly became silent. One by one, employees, executives, engineers, and construction workers rose from their seats, not because anyone instructed them to stand, but because genuine respect required no invitation. Victoria quietly lowered her eyes, understanding that the greatest lesson of her career had never been taught inside a business school or corporate seminar. It had been taught by a father wearing work boots who chose grace instead of resentment when given every reason to respond differently. As evening settled across Chicago, Daniel drove home with Emily beside him, the city lights reflecting softly across the windshield while the completed tower stood peacefully in the distance. It had become more than steel, concrete, and glass. It had become a lasting reminder that dignity never needs to raise its voice, that true leadership begins with humility, and that the strongest foundations are always built by people whose character remains steady even when the world refuses to recognize their worth. In the end, the board did not simply turn against pride. They turned toward respect, and that quiet choice became the strongest legacy anyone could have left behind.